Hey everybody, Aaron Mac BS Detector. Back again to read some more. Is this part 8? Part 7? I'll have to look when I'm uploading the video and see which part it is. But we are just gonna keep chugging along here. We are I'd say maybe like a third of the way through with the book. But I'm literally just recording it like 45-minute intervals because I wouldn't want to sit and watch like a 5-hour video of someone reading. And I also don't want to sit here for 5 hours and read. I feel like 45 minutes is like a good digestible amount of time. And we can just kind of get through these chapters and keep it moving. So I'm going to jump back into it where we left off. They actually brought up the term Zionist and Zionism. Because it's talking about a letter that was delivered, I guess, to King Joseph, who is the Khazar king, from a guy named Hasdai. And I'm trying to remember who is Hasdai. I think Hasdai was maybe a Muslim. Let's see. It talks about Hasdai. I can't remember where it said he was from, but I think he was a Muslim, maybe in and around the area of Byzantium. I'm not really sure. But regardless, Hasdai is the one that is retelling this part of this historical account of the Khazars, of which I guess there's just not a lot of information, which I don't find that to be surprising either. So, it talks about how in the beginning of the letter, there's a lot of happiness and praise for the Jays in Spain, but then it kind of ends in bitterness of the exile and has a lot of Shminist fervor and messianic hope when the Messiah came in the first century. Anyways, okay. So, I guess it says basically I guess he offered to enter into the king's service. So maybe he was a J. I'm not sure this Hasdai person is, but I know he was a person that was like telling the story of this history of this King Joseph, the king of the Khazars. So we are in section 5 in is it chapter 2, which is conversion? Yeah. Okay. So it says, King Joseph's reply is less accomplished and moving than Hasdai's letter. No wonder, as Cassell remarks, quote, scholarship and culture reigned not among the jays of the Volga, but on the rivers of Spain, end quote. The highlight of the reply is the story of the conversion already quoted. No doubt Joseph, too, employed a scribe for penning it, probably a scholarly refugee from Byzantium. Nevertheless, the reply sounds like a voice out of the Old Testament compared to the polished cadences of the 10th century modern statesman. It starts with a fanfare of greetings, then reiterates the main contents of Hasdai's letter, proudly emphasizing that the Khazar kingdom gives the lie to those who say that, quote, the scepter of Judah has forever fallen from the Jews' hands, and that there is no place on earth for a kingdom of their own, end quote. This is followed by a rather cryptic remark to the effect that, quote, already our fathers have exchanged friendly letters which are preserved in our archives and are known to our elders, end quote. So it already sounds to me like they're starting to manufacture their own history so that they can attempt to make themselves look like they are the actual ancient Hebrews when they're not. They've converted to Judaism. And there's an asterisk after this, so let's read this footnote. It says, this may refer to a 9th century Jayish traveler Eldad Hadani, whose fantastic tales, much read in the Middle Ages, include mentions of Khazaria, which he says is inhabited by 3 of the lost tribes of Israel and collects tributes from 28 neighboring kingdoms. Eldad visited Spain around 880 and may or may not have visited the Khazar country. Hasdai briefly mentions him in his letter to Joseph as if to ask what to make of him. So there's that little tidbit of information. All right, it says Joseph then proceeds to provide a genealogy of his people. Though a fierce Jewish nationalist proud of wielding, quote, the scepter of Judah, end quote, he cannot and does not claim for the Semitic descent. He traces their ancestry not to Shem, not to Noah's third son, Japheth. Oh, I'm sorry, but to Noah's third son, Japheth, which I've always said, like, Ashkenaz is a son of Japheth, if that's what we're actually talking about. And more precisely to Japheth's grandson Togarmah, the ancestor of all the Turkish tribes. Quote, we have found in the family registers of our fathers, end quote. Joseph asserts boldly, quote, that Togarmah had 10 sons, and the names of their offspring are as follows: Uger, Dirsu, Avars, Huns, Basili, Tarniak, Khazars, Zagora, Bulgars, Sabir. We are the sons of Khazar, the 7th, end quote. The identity of some of these tribes with names spelt in the Hebrew script is rather dubious, as is, I think, the Hebrew language as a whole, but that's just another one of my opinions. But that hardly matters. The characteristic feature in this genealogical exercise is the amalgamation of Genesis with Turkish tribal tradition, right? And it also throws a sideline on the frequent description of the Khazars as the people of Magog. Magog, according to Genesis 10, 2 through 3, was the much maligned uncle of Togarmah. After the genealogy, Joseph mentions briefly some military conquests by his ancestors, which carried them as far as the Danube. Then follows at great length the story of Bulon's conversion. Quote, from this day onwards, Joseph continues, quote, the Lord gave him strength and aided him. He had himself and his followers circumcised and sent for Jewish sages who taught him the law and explained the commandments, end quote. There follow more boasts about military victories, conquered nations, etc., and then a significant passage. After these events, one of his Bulon's grandsons became king. His name was Obadiah. He was a brave and venerated man who reformed the rule, fortified the law according to tradition and usage, built synagogues and schools, assembled a multitude of Israel's sages, gave them lavish gifts of gold and silver, and made them interpret the 24, quote, sacred books, end quote, the Mishnah, which is the precepts, and the Talmud, and the order in which the liturgies are to be said. So this is just basically telling you that, you know, they consulted maybe with some people that might have been descended from one of the tribes. It sounds like maybe the Sephardi's were, or they could have just been Spanish people that converted. I'm sorry. It's early in the morning. Converted to Judaism. But I don't know. And I haven't studied that out, but we can look into it. So it's like you can see there, they're already starting to, you know, go hard in the paint, as it were, on being Jewish and following Judaism with their synagogues and their all this. It says, this indicates that about a couple of generations after Bulon, a religious revival or reformation took place, possibly accompanied by a coup d'etat on the lines envisaged by Artamanov. It seems, indeed, that the Judaization of the Khazars proceeded in several steps. We remember that King Bulon drove out, quote, the sorcerers and idolaters, end quote, before the angel appeared to him, and that he made his covenant with, quote, the true God, end quote, before deciding whether he was the Jewish, Christian, or Muslim God. It seems highly probable that the conversion of King Bulan and his followers was another intermediary step, that they embraced a primitive or rudimentary form of Judaism based on the Bible alone, excluding the Talmud, all rabbinical literature, and the observances derived from it. In this respect, they resembled the Karaites, a fundamentalist sect which originated in the 8th century in Persia and spread among Jays all over the world, particularly in, quote, Little Khazaria. So even the Karaites, people act like, oh, well, they're like the original. No, they're not either. It says right here that they converted. Or they originated in the 8th century. So that's way past Old Testament stuff. Okay, and Little Khazari was in the Crimea. Dunlop and some other authorities surmised that between Bulan and Obadiah, i.e. roughly between 740 and 800, some form of Karaism prevailed in the country, and that Orthodox, quote, rabbinic Judaism was only introduced in the course of Obadiah's religious reform. The point is of some importance because Karaism apparently survived in Khazaria to the end, and villages of Turkish-speaking Karaite Jays, obviously of Khazar origin, still existed in modern times. Thus, the Judaization of the Khazars was a gradual process which, triggered off by political expediency, slowly penetrated into the deeper strata of their minds and eventually produced the Messianism of their period of decline. Their religious commitment survived the collapse of their state and persisted, as we shall see, in the Khazar Jayish settlements of Russia and Poland. Section 6. After mentioning Obadiah's religious reforms, Joseph gives a list of his successors: Hezekiah his son, and his son Manasseh, and Hanukkah the brother of Obadiah, and Isaac his son, Manasseh his son, Nisi his son, Menachem his son, Benjamin his son, Aaron his son, and I am Joseph, son of Aaron the blessed, and we are all sons of kings, and no stranger was allowed to occupy the throne of our fathers. Next, Joseph attempts to answer Hasdai's questions about the size and topography of his country, but he does not seem to have a competent person at his court who could match the skill of the Arab geographers, and his obscure reference to other countries and nations add little to what we know from Ibn Hakel, Masudi, and the other Persian and Arabic sources. He claims to collect tribute from 37 nations, which seems a rather tall proposition, yet Dunlop points out that 9 of these appear to be tribes living in the Khazar heartland, and the remaining 28 agree quite well with Ibn Fadlan's mention of 25 wives, each the daughter of a vassal king, and also with Eldad Hadani's dubious tales. We must further bear in mind the multitude of Slavonic tribes along the upper reaches of the Dnieper and as far as Moscow, which, as we shall see, pay tribute to the Khazars. However that may be, there is no reference in Joseph's letter to a royal harem, only a mention of a single queen and her maids and eunuchs. These are said to live in one of the 3 boroughs of Joseph's capital, Ital. Quote, in the second live Israelite, Ishmaelis, Christians, and other nations who speak other languages. The third, which is an island, I inhabit myself, with the princes, bondsmen, and all the servants that belong to me, end quote. It says this division of Ital into 3 parts is also mentioned, as we have seen, in some of the Arab sources. We live in the town through the whole of winter, but in the month of Nisan, which is March and April, we set out and everyone goes to labor in his field and in his garden. Every clan has his hereditary estate, for which they head with joy and jubilation. No voice of an intruder can be heard there. No enemy is to be seen. The country does not have much rain, but there are many rivers with a multitude of big fish and many sources, and it is generally fertile and fat in its fields and vineyards, gardens and orchards, which are irrigated by the rivers and bear rich fruit, and with God's help, I live in peace, end quote. The next passage is devoted to the date of the coming Messiah. We have our eyes on the sages of Jerusalem and Babylon, and although we live far away from Zion, we have nevertheless heard that the calculations are erroneous owing to the great profusion of sins. and we know nothing. Only the Eternal knows how deep the count. We have nothing to hold on, only the prophecies of Daniel, and may the Eternal speed up our deliverances. And we already know, most of us already know, that every single last prophecy of Daniel has come to pass, except for these Shemayanist Christians that teach this gap theory and say that there's like a gap between, the 69th and 70th week or something like that. It doesn't make any sense. But I digress. All right. So, and may the Eternal speed up our deliverance. Yeah, I find that they've been we want Moshiach now and all this stuff, these Sheminists. So they're still waiting, and he came like 800 years before these people even, or 700 years before these people even converted to the supposed religion that Jesus came through, or, you grew up having to learn and all that. Torah. Okay. It says the concluding paragraph of Joseph's letter is a reply to Hasdai's apparent offer to enter into the service of the Khazar king. Thou hast mentioned in thy letter a desire to see my face. I too wish and long to behold thy gracious face and the splendor of thy magnificence, wisdom, and greatness. I wish that thy words will come true, and that I should know the happiness to hold thee in my embrace, and to see thy dear, friendly, and agreeable face. Thou wouldst be to me as a father, and I see thee as a son, all my people. Okay, wait. All my people, all my people would kiss my lips. We would come and go according to thy wishes and thy wishes counsel. Sounding kind of gay, ain't it? There is a passage in Joseph's letter which deals with topical politics and is rather obscure. With the help of the Almighty, I guard the mouth of the river, the Volga, and do not permit the Rus who come in their ships to invade the land of the Arabs. I fight heavy wars with them, the Rus, for if I allowed it, they would devastate the lands of Ishmael, even to Baghdad. So you see here that they have admitted themselves they're not Semitic in any way, and they really are having more to do with the Ishmaelites than any of the 12 tribes. So take that for what it's worth. Joseph here appears to pose as the defender of the Baghdad Caliphate against the Norman Rus raiders. This might seem a little tactless in view of the bitter hostility between the Umayyad Caliphate of Cordoba, which Hasdai is serving, and the Abbasid Caliphs of Baghdad. On the other hand, the vagaries of Byzantine policy toward the Khazars made it expedient for Joseph to appear in the role of a defender of Islam, regardless of the schism between the two caliphates. At least he could hope that Hasdai, the experienced diplomat, would take the hint. The meeting between the two correspondents, if ever seriously intended, never took place. No further letters, if any were exchanged, have ever been preserved. The factual content of the, quote, Khazar correspondence, end quote, is meager and adds little to what was already known from other sources. Its fascination lies in the bizarre fragmentary vistas that it conveys, like an erratic searchlight focusing on disjointed regions in the dense fog that covers the period. And that's probably because they were constructing a history, or attempting to legitimize, So, okay, this is section 7 of chapter 2. Among other Hebrew sources, there is, quote, the Cambridge document, and I would like to know what he means by Hebrew. I really would. So called after its present location at the Cambridge University Library. It was discovered at the end of the last century, together with other priceless documents in the, quote, Cairo Geniza, end quote, the storeroom of an ancient synagogue, by the Cambridge scholar Solomon Schechter. The document is in a bad state. It is a letter or copy of a letter consisting of about 100 lines in Hebrew. The beginning and the end are missing, so that it is impossible to know who wrote it and to whom it was addressed. King Joseph is mentioned in it as a contemporary and referred to as, quote, my lord, end quote. Khazaria is called, quote, our land, end quote. So the most plausible inference is that the letter was written by a Khazar J of King Joseph's court in Joseph's lifetime, i.e., that is roughly contemporaneous with the quote Khazar correspondence. Some authorities have further suggested that it was addressed to Hasdai ibn Shaprat and handed in Constantinople to Hasdai's unsuccessful envoy, Isaac Bar Nathan, who brought it back to Cordoba, whence it found its way to Cairo when the Jays were expelled from Spain. And I wonder what time that was, because we know it's 109 and counting. All right. At any rate, internal evidence indicates that the document originated not later than the 11th century and more likely in Joseph's lifetime in the 10th. It contains another legendary account of the conversion, but its main significance is political. The writer speaks of an attack on Khazaria by the Alans, acting under Byzantine instigation, under Joseph's father, Aaron the Blessed. No other Greek or Arab source seems to mention this campaign, but there is a significant passage in Constantine Porphyrogenitus's De Administrando Imperio, written in 947 to 950, which lends some credibility to the unknown letter writer's statements. Concerning Khazaria, how war is to be made upon them and by whom, as the Gus are able to make war on the Khazars, being near them, so likewise the ruler of Alania, because the 9 climates of Khazaria, the fertile region north of the Caucasus, are close to Alania, and the Alan can, if he wishes, raid them and cause great damage and distress to the Khazars from that quarter. Now, according to Joseph's letter, the ruler of the Alans paid tribute to him, and whether in fact he did or did not, his feelings toward the Kagan were probably much the same as the Bulgar kings. The passage in Constantine revealing his efforts to incite the Alans to war against the Khazars ironically reminds one of Ibn Fadlan's mission with a parallel purpose. Evidently, the days of the Byzantine Khazar rapprochement were long past in Joseph's time, but I am anticipating later developments to be discussed in chapter 3. Well, I guess now I am too. So this is section 8 of chapter 2. About a century after the Khazar correspondence and the presumed date of the Cambridge document, Yehuda Halevi wrote his once celebrated book, Khuzari, the Khazars. Halevi, from 1085 to 1141, is generally considered the greatest, quote, Hebrew poet of Spain. And I'm putting the quotation marks in there myself because Hebrew is wild work, okay? Like totally wild work. This book, however, was written in Arabic and translated later into Hebrew. See what I mean? Like, there is no ancient Hebrew language. It's totally made up, bro. Its subtitle is, quote, The Book of Proof and Argument in Defense of the Despised Faith, end quote. See, here we go. Starting to sound real Shmayanist already. Oh, Haveli was a Shmayanist who died on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. The Khuzari, written a year before his death, is a philosophical tract propounding the view that the Jewish nation is the sole mediator between God and the rest of mankind. See where these lies started from? At the end of history, Jesus is the only mediator between God and us, okay? That's it, not the Jays. And this is where we're at. Christians give more heed to the Zionist state of Israel than they do to the word of Jesus. So much so that we've got people like Kay Podgy out here trying to get you to follow Torah. Stop it. Get some help. Anyways. Okay. Okay. At the end of history, all other nations will be converted to Judaism, it says. And the conversion of the Khazars appears as a symbol of or token of that ultimate event. So this has been planned for like 1,000 years. Over 1,000 years. I mean, and the what's wild to me is like literally the generations upon generations of people that have been, what's the word that I'm looking for? They've been initiated into this cult, you know, that all of these religions bring about as cults. But these guys have been very secretive. in cahoots, I think, probably with the Jesuits. So, anyways, okay. In spite of its title, this tract has little to say about the Khazar country itself, which serves mainly as a backdrop for yet another legendary account of the conversion. The king, the angel, the Jewish scholar, etc., and for the philosophical and theological dialogues between the king and the protagonist of three religions. And I was going to say this story about him summoning a Jay and summoning a Muslim and summoning a Christian, and, being saying that, the Christian and the Muslim both agreed on, that at least the Old Testament was correct. So that's what he chose. That sounded so made up to me. Very, very made up. However, there are a few factual references which indicate that Halevi had either read the correspondence between Hasdai and Joseph or had other sources of information about the Khazar country. Thus, we are informed that after the appearance of the angel, the king of the Khazars, quote, revealed the secret of his dream to the general of his army, end quote. And, quote, the general, end quote, also looms large later on, another obvious reference to the dual rule of Kagan and Beck. Halevi also mentions the histories and books of the Khazars, end quote, which reminds one of Joseph, speaking of our archives, end quote, where documents of state are kept. Lastly, Halevi twice in different places of the book gives the date of the conversion as having taken place, quote, 400 years ago, end quote, in the year 4500, end quote. And that's according to the Jayish calendar. This points to AD 740, which is most likely the date. All in all, it is a poor harvest as far as factual statements are concerned from a book that enjoyed immense popularity among the Jays of the Middle Ages. Well, yeah, they had to be told what their fake history was, so I'm sure it was popular to them. But the medieval mind was less attracted by fact than by fable, and the Jays were more interested in the date of the coming Messiah than in the geographical data. The Arab geographers, and chroniclers had a similarly cavalier attitude to distances, dates, and the frontiers between fact and fancy. This also applies to the famed German Jewish traveler Rabbi Petachia of Ratisbon, who visited Eastern Europe and Western Asia between 1170 and 1185. His travelogue, Sibub HaOlam, quote, Journey Around the World, end quote, was apparently written by a pupil based on his notes or on dictation. It relates how shocked the good rabbi was by the primitive observances of the Khazar Jays north of the Crimea, which he attributed to their adherence to the Karaite heresy. And the Rabbi Petachia asked them, quote, why do you not believe in the words of the sages, i.e. the Talmudists, end quote? And they replied, quote, because our fathers did not teach them to us, end quote. On the eve of Shabbat, they cut all the bread which they eat on the Shabbat. They eat in the dark and sit the whole day in one spot. Their prayers consist only of the Psalms. Spending the Shabbat in dark was a well-known Karaite custom. You hear that, K-Podgy? So besides microwaving your food, you need to be sitting in the dark, girlfriend. I'm just kidding. I love K-Podgy. I just want her to come to like the truth and stop deceiving people for real, for real. So incensed that was the rabbi that he subsequently crossed the Khazar heartland. All he had to say was that it took him 8 days, during which, quote, he heard the wailing of women and the barking of dogs, end quote. He does mention, however, that while he was in Baghdad, he had seen envoys from the Khazar kingdom looking for needy Jewish scholars from Mesopotamia and even from Egypt, quote, to teach their children Torah and Talmud, end quote. This is just so fascinating. So, while few Jewish travelers from the West undertook the hazardous journey to the Volga, they recorded encounters with Khazar Jays at all principal centers of the civilized world. Rabbi Petachia met them in Baghdad. Benjamin of Tuleda, another famous traveler of the 12th century, visited Khazar notables in Constantinople and Alexandria. Ibrahim bin Dawud a contemporary of Judah Halevi's, reports that he had seen in Toledo, quote, some of their descendants, pupils of the wise, end quote. Tradition has it that these were Khazar princes. One is tempted to think of Indian princelings sent to Cambridge to study. Yet there is a curious ambivalence in the attitude toward the Khazars of the leaders of Orthodox Jewry in the East, centered on the Talmudic Academy in Baghdad. The Gaon, Hebrew for excellency, who stood at the head of the academy, was the spiritual leader of the Jewish settlements dispersed all over the Near East and Middle East, while the exilarch, or, quote, prince of captivity, end quote, represented the secular power over these more or less autonomous communities. Saadia Gaon, 882 to 942, most famous among the spiritual excellencies, who left voluminous writings, repeatedly refers in them to the Khazars. He mentions a Mesopotamian Jay who went to Khazaria to settle there, as if it were an everyday occurrence. He speaks obscurely of the Khazar court. Elsewhere, he explains that in the biblical expression Hiram of Tyre, Hiram is not a proper name but a royal title, like Caliph for the ruler of the Arabs and Kagan for the king of the Khazars. Thus, Khazaria was very much, quote, on the map in the literal and metaphorical sense for the leaders of the ecclesiastical hierarchy of Oriental Jewry, but at the same time, the Khazars were regarded with certain misgivings, both on racial grounds and because their suspected leanings toward the Karaite heresy. One 11th century Hebrew author, Japheth ibn Ali, himself a Karaite, explains the words mamzer, which is bastard, by the example of the Khazars who became Jays without belonging to the race. His contemporary, Jacob ben Reuben, reflects the opposite side of his ambivalent attitude by speaking of the Khazars as a, quote, a single nation who do not bear the yoke of the exile, but are great warriors paying no tribute to the Gentiles, end quote. In summing up the quote, and I'm using quotes here because they call this Hebrew, but I don't think that's the correct word. The Hebrew sources on the Khazars that have come down to us, one senses a mixed reaction of enthusiasm, skepticism, and above all, bewilderment, probably because they made it all up. A warrior nation of Turkish Jays must have seemed to the rabbis as strange as a circumcised unicorn. During 1,000 years of dispersion, the Jays had forgotten what it was like to have a king in a country. The Moshiach was more real to them than the Kagan. Which is wild because, even if you believe this Zionist lie that, they never had their own homeland, well, it seems like they did in these years during, Byzantium and everything. Like, they had this whole land. I am sorry, my ear is itching. This whole land of Eastern Europe and, Russian, where Russia is and stuff. So, what do they even mean? They need their own homeland. It sounds like they had it and they lost it somehow or something. And so then they had to use more trickery to get the British Empire to give them Schmalestein. This crap has been going on forever. It's wild. Okay, as a postscript to the Arab and Hebrew sources relating to the conversion, it should be mentioned that the apparently earliest Christian source antedates them both. At some date earlier than 864, the Westphalian monk Christian Drukmar of Aquitania wrote a Latin treatise, Expositio in Evangelium Mate, in which he reports that, quote, there exist people under the sky in regions where no Christians can be found, whose name is Gog and Magog, and who are Huns. Among them is one called the Gazari, who are uncircumcised, who are circumcised and observe Judaism in its entirety, end quote. This remark occurs apropos of Matthew 24:14, which says, and this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. Which has no apparent bearing on it, and no more is heard of the subject. Yeah, because that was, Jesus had just told them earlier, either earlier or later in this chapter, that he would be coming back to that generation, and that some people standing there would actually see him return. So I don't even know why Christians at this point are even waiting on a Messiah to come, like he clearly already came. Okay, section 9 of chapter 2. At about the same time when Drutmar wrote down what he knew from hearsay about the Jewish Khazars, a famed Christian missionary sent by the Byzantine emperor attempted to convert them to Christianity. He was no less a figure than Saint Cyril, quote, apostle of the Slavs, end quote, alleged designer of the Cyrillic alphabet. He and his elder brother, Saint Methodius, were entrusted with this and other proselytizing missions by the Emperor Michael III on the advice of the Patriarch Photius, himself apparently of Khazar descent, for it is reported that the Emperor once called him in anger Khazar face, like poopy face or something. Khazar face. That's hilarious. Very hilarious. Cyril's proselytizing efforts seem to have been successful among the Slavonic people in Eastern Europe, but not among the Khazars. He traveled to their country via Cherson in the Crimea. In Cherson, he is said to have spent 6 months learning Hebrew in preparation for his mission. He then took the, quote, Khazarian way, end quote, the Don Volga portage to Idil, and from there traveled along the Caspian to meet the Kagan. It is not said where. The usual theological disputations followed, but they had little impact on the Khazar Jays. Even the adultery, Vita Constantine, Cyril's original name, says only that Cyril made a good impression on the Kagan, but that a few people were baptized and 200 Christian prisoners were released by the Kagan as a gesture of goodwill. It was the least he could do for the emperor's envoy who had gone to so much trouble. There is a curious sideline thrown on the story by students of Slavonic philology. Cyril is credited by tradition not only with having devised the Cyrillic, but also the Glagolitic alphabet. Say that 3 times fast. The latter, according to Barron, was, quote, used in Croatia to the 17th century. Its indebtedness to the Hebrew alphabet in at least 11 characters, representing in part the Slavonic sounds, has long been recognized, end quote. The 11 characters are A, B, V, G, E, K, P, R, S, and then the SCH and T. This seems to confirm what has been said earlier on about the influence of the Hebrew alphabet in spreading literacy among the neighbors of the Khazars. I'm just very confused about that because as far as I know, the first record of the, quote, Hebrew Bible is from 1008, and it's the Leningrad Codex. So I don't know what he's talking about, Hebrew anything. Okay, normally I would keep going, but we're at 38 minutes now, and we're at a good stopping point because a whole new chapter is about to begin. So I'm going to stop here. I'm going to upload this. I need to run out and run a couple of errands, and I'll probably be back and try to read some more just so we can start trying to get through this. Anyways, I hope wherever you're at, whatever time it is, you're having an awesome day. And I love you guys. Boom, 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 boom. Okay, see you later.